All right, welcome everybody to the virtual brown bag of let's see, March 25th of 2021. Oh, I'm on the wrong strategy.
Yes.
I'm telling you, it's been a long week. This was last night's meeting. Oh man, see, when you're involved with so many community type of things. There we go. There. Nope, not that one. That one. For brown bag. Jesus. Yeah. I was just telling George it's been a long week for me, and this is proof. All right, virtual brown bag. That's what we are doing right now. As usual, we record all these meetings for folks to, catch on later if they were not able to attend, or sometimes we do share a lot of goodies and we want to, reshare with coworkers or friends, or even come back later. That I do that quite often, where it's like, oh, I remember George shared something, about TypeScript, and then I go back and rewatch it to refresh my mind as to what we were talking about. So we have those shared. Make sure if you're sharing something that's sensitive, you maybe you don't, or you make sure to de-identify what it is that you're sharing. Um, Virtual Brown Bag is a place where we get together here to share tips and tricks, experiences, questions that we might have about something challenging that we're trying to implement or approach. And, by sharing our challenges with others, we get to grow together or leverage experiences from other folks who have been, through the same kind of situations, maybe. Logistics, we do this every Thursday from 12 to 1 Central Time here on Skype, free for everybody to join in. So make sure to spread the word and, hopefully get more people so that we keep adding to the variety of topics that we discuss and variety of levels as well. We have shared on a number of different topics, sometimes very technical, sometimes more like soft skill type of thing. Usually everything related to either being a software developer or being a professional working, with other people. Those topics also come up. We have a virtualbrownbag.com website where you can always find the link to this meeting here to join in, as well as links to the previous videos with a little blurb on the main topics that we've discussed there. So it makes it easy for people to go back and watch it or decide on, which ones they would like to watch. And that's it. Let's get things rolling. So, what are you guys up to? What's challenging? What's new that you've been learning recently? Nothing. Nobody learning not learning anything.
Um, I guess start. So
George,
I
I see
haven't.
that. Sorry, man. Just a second.
It's
George,
cool.
I see
Yeah,
that
go
you're
ahead.
talking. Okay, you're on mute.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, man. Was it Mike?
Oh yeah, sorry.
There you
Yeah,
go.
yeah. So I'm working with TypeScript and React Native on a project right now, and I'm on the front end. And there's been it's been a while. Like I'm fairly new to development. And the last few projects I've been on, I've been like done a little bit with the front end, but it hasn't been as detailed as what I'm doing now. So it's been a good experience, like getting a refresher on like margin, padding, and everything CSS and Flexbox related. Um, so that's been pretty fun because I forgot how detailed and meticulous front end positioning can be.
Okay,
So
hold on. So you're saying that you're messing with CSS and you're thinking it's fun? Well, there's something wrong there, man. What's wrong with you?
Come on, that's fine.
it's it's really fun actually, man. Because
Good.
I don't know, I just enjoy learning all
Oh
kind of
yeah,
stuff. So like,
absolutely.
it's a lot to learn for sure.
Have
Yeah.
you learned about box sizing yet? Is that
Not not yet, not yet.
all right? Let me give you this download really quickly because it helps so much to understand this. Um, so normally in CSS, right? So the model that you kind of have is you have the content width, the content, the padding, the board, and the margin, right?
Yeah.
So we also have this width property, right? Width, height. It's weird to say by itself because it sounds like width. But the question is, when I say something has a width of 200 pixels, what exactly am I talking about? Does that include margin, border, stuff like that? And the thing is that there are different models for that, which leads to a lot of confusion. It's not quite as bad now that we have CSS Grid, but it still happens. So the basic model that you have in CSS is called content box. That's the default one, depending on the browser. And with a content box, when you say width is 100 pixels, what that means is that's just the width of the content. So that doesn't include the padding. Padding is additional. Borders additional. Margins additional, which is a little weird if you think about it as a mental model, because you tend to think of padding as internal. Otherwise, what the heck is the point of having yet another thing out there? It is actually possible and encouraged. I think lots of CSS resets do this, to flip the model to be what's called a border box. So padding counts toward width. I think border also counts toward width. So 100 pixels is including of all that, and just margin is outside of it, which is a lot more useful kind of as a model. And to do that, there's a CSS property called box sizing, and you do border box. So if you use like a CSS reset, a lot of times you can look and you'll see that one of the first things it does is it does star, so select all elements, and for them do box sizing border box. If you don't do it and you're trying to figure it out, you can run into lots of like head banging, being like, why I'm setting two things to width 50%, and yet they don't seem to be taking out 50%. What's happening? So that's kind of a trick there. Most of the time you want box sizing border box on things.
Okay. Yeah, it's been fun because you gotta think of like different screen sizes and how to account for that. You can't just set standard lengths and widths of things. You gotta account for different things of the sort. So it's been pretty fun, surprisingly, Claudio.
Yeah.
That's good, man. Yeah, no, I joke. I'm not a big fan of working with CSS, so I'm always very thankful for the guys like you who, enjoy it and have fun. So whenever I'm having like weird layout issues and stuff, it's like, here, man, go to town with it.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Blue beans.
I have a question I could ask.
Wait.
Go ahead.
George, I had one question. So I came across types versus interfaces in TypeScript, and like because they seem so similar, they behave so similar, and like trying to, of course, like set up some kind of standard for like when to use what in the project, but like the actual difference between the two, and like when to use an interface versus a type versus, like, because I see like they behave the same. You can use them interchangeably, but I don't see like the point of having two that can do the same type of
Big question. That is unfortunately a fundamental awkwardness of TypeScript. So kind of to give you a little bit of context. So TypeScript comes out of the tradition of kind of C#, which comes from Java, which comes from C and C++, class oriented.
Okay.
Their approach to doing typing is to be all around about classes and hierarchies of classes, and in systems like Java and C#, interfaces are a way of saying, hey, here's something, you could have whatever concrete classes, but they could all do this stuff. So interfaces. So when they brought kind of the concept to TypeScript, especially with Anders Hazelberg being the designer who created C#, you had to kind of have this concept of interfaces in there. But additionally, it kind of brings in this other type model of algebraic data types, which is not supported, not in C#, really. And in that model, the concept of interfaces isn't super useful because you can just have a type that says, hey, here's a type and it's a method foo, and you can compose that type via type intersections into other types.
Right.
And then so it kind of matches. So my personal preference is to use types wherever possible.
Okay.
I would because if you use interfaces are just a lot more useful when you're using classes a lot. And my TypeScript, the way I use TypeScript, I almost never use classes. It's just not
it's
part of my it's part of my tool set, but it's just I never need them when I use it. If you're using classes, then you would use an interface. Interfaces do have interfaces are missing so first of all, when we say types, we mean the type keyword, which is technically called type aliases. That has some abilities in terms of they can be composed and decomposed very easily. Interfaces have an ability that type aliases don't have, which is that, and this part is actually very different from C# or anything like that, which is if you import an interface into your class that comes from another project, you can then extend that interface, like add methods to that interface, and that extension happens everywhere, like within your project, not in the project. So if you need that, and you usually don't, then you would have to do an interface because you're importing an interface. But yeah, it's unfortunately a fundamental awkwardness, and there isn't really great resolution there. You could find blog posts that are like, yes, you should use types all the time. You can find blog posts that say, that's too complicated. 100%.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And we don't use we use mainly all functional components anyway, so don't really see the benefit there. So okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I would avoid interfaces unless you need something that an interface does, right? Which is usually only going to come from when you have classes or when you're using a library that relies on interfaces and you extend them or something.
Right, which is pretty rare, I think. So
yeah, depending on your coding style, yes.
Cool.
Let me throw a follow-up question there. Like a couple of weeks ago, I was mentioning this about TypeScript, where it mostly enforces type checking during compile time, and a lot of that information gets lost during runtime. Is there any difference between interfaces and types as far as runtime discovery of what's there, George? Okay.
All that is gone there. I think I remember seeing that there was some TypeScript experiment, and I don't even know if it was in the proper thing, but which would write metadata on the interfaces and types into the objects.
Okay.
But I haven't actually seen that in use anywhere, and I don't even know if it was part of the TSC compiler or it was just something else that kind of someone that people were trying. Once you start doing that, that would be more along the lines of kind of how Python works, where Python typing actually does get written into the objects, just the Python language itself doesn't use it, but you can actually grab that metadata and use it and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Let's see. So there was a question there.
Yeah. So Sharon wanted to ask about TDD.
Actually. So the thing is that I do a couple of research about TDD, and finally I come with the idea of what TDD really is. But somehow there are some other things, or some other definition about TDD, or even I'm here to ask mostly about the mindset of TDD. The thing that I understand from the explanation that I found in internet is that TDD means before you do any code for your requirement, for example, it would be a component, a class, or anything, you need to think for a failure case. It means that you need to think how you need to challenge your code before you even start writing your code. So in this mindset, it somehow helps you to reduce your bugs, because before you implement any code, you think about the bugs that can happen in your code. Secondly, in TDD, I think it's not focusing on code structure or things like, of course, it's mentioned for refactoring, but it does not mention for having a clean code base. So the most idea of TDD is that to just follow a mindset that before you implement anything, before you do any coding, you know what you're facing, and you know the weakness and the weak point of your code. So is that clear? Or even if can someone explain us a short brief of TD, it would be great.
Short brief, you lost me there.
A brief explanation of TDD, I mean.
I think both Claudio and I, and maybe even some of the other people on this call, have a lot to say on this subject. I will say that what you just said right now is certainly pretty good ballpark correct. Like if someone gave me that answer in an interview, I'd be like, awesome, this person has good, mature thoughts on this. I have additional thoughts, but that's I mean, Claudio, what do you think? You want to kind of give a shot at this?
Yes. Again, I'll try to make it as brief as I can. But one thing that I always tell people about, like the way I've developed my own understanding of TDD, it took like several iterations, right? And I usually tell people, it's like, okay, I first started writing automated tests, right? Okay, you instantiate objects and then you make calls and then you assert on the results. And I thought I was writing unit tests, and then next thing I know is I push that up into source control, the other guy pulls the code, and then like 80% of the tests fail because the guy didn't have the same database that I had, and then I learned that I was writing integration tests, not unit tests. So that took me to the next step, which was, okay, now let me understand how I can decompose my code, right, where I'm actually writing unit tests and not integration tests. And then I started learning about mocks and all that kind of stuff. And then I started learning about TDD as in test-driven development, right, where the way it's normally taught. And then I remember at the time some people said, well, yeah, there is, test first and test last, because some people would defend the idea that if I just wrote the code, the implementation code, and I write the tests the same day, the same moment, that's TDD. I would argue that that is not, because when you write implementation code and then you write the tests, you are shaping the tests based on the implementation. You are looking at the structure of your code, and then you're thinking about the tests you have to write to cover that code. That's not what TDD is about, right? If you think not in the sense of test-driven development, but test-driven design. When you write the test first, you should be thinking about the API into your code that you would like to have by the time you're done, not the implementation, not of the structure of your code, right? So that's when I started thinking, okay, I do need to think about the code I would like to have, and that's where TDD came in. It's like, okay, I believe I should have a class named X that doesn't take anything into the parameter and the constructor, and then I'm going to have a method named X, Y, and Z that will take parameters of type this, that, or the other, right? Making those decisions. Like, let's say it's a method that's supposed to take a parameter that represents a money amount. I could say, well, I'll take in a decimal. Well, is it a decimal the best representation of a money amount? Maybe I want to create a money type to encapsulate that abstraction, right? So I make those decisions before I actually implement the code. Once I can see that in front of me, And that makes sense. Like, okay, now let me start writing code that will implement that. From there, I've learned to think of those tests as context-based testing, because when we do this, like one test file or test fixture per class, we are still thinking about the implementation. We are thinking about, okay, I'm going to write this class and all these methods, but we're missing the overall behavior. So I switched over into this context-based test where I think of the behavior, I think of the context, and I don't care as to whether I'm going to have one class, multiple classes, one method, multiple methods. I don't care. It's like, let me think about the behavior first, and then I write the code that will implement that behavior. Sometimes I end up with one class. Sometimes I look at it and it's like, oh, this class now it's too large. I need to break it down. So that to me is what enables really refactoring, which is changing the internal implementation without changing the external behavior, right? So if I'm writing tests to cover the implementation, I'm failing at that, right? If I have tests that describe the behavior, then yes, I can actually change the implementation without worrying, about changing the behavior. So how's that for a short explanation? Does that work? Sorry, guys.
Good.
I
Claudio, just a just like a quick aside. How do you begin that process? Because I know, like George, I learned like a when then to kind of like draw my thoughts out to begin the test. Um, or, well, like the initial test before writing code. But is there anything you do differently, or like any methods that you do to like start that process?
What I normally recommend people is just start learning how to write tests, right? Just know the test framework that you're going to be using, right? Like a Jest, Jasmine, or, in C Sharp land, MS Test, XUnit, whatever it is. Learn how to use the test framework, the main pieces, and how to use the test runner. Start there, right? And then later you start learning about, okay, how do I mock things? How do I stub things? What is the difference between interaction-based testing and state-based testing? Those can come later. I normally don't. I know that some people like starting with like, oh, you should just start with TDD. And that has never worked for me. It's like, okay, first learn, before writing Shakespeare, you should learn the basic words of the language. Once you've practiced that for a while, then you can start like evolving from there. So my personal recommendation is pick the test framework and learn how to write some tests for it. The test may read like clunky and cluttered. It doesn't matter. At least you're practicing that muscle.
You could also
Cool.
just
Thank
use
you.
the test framework to automate stuff.
Yes.
Just as a little dashboard where you can run a thing and then it does run some code, and that's still learning things, right? Um, I will say, Claudia, I think you missed one phase that I
Okay.
know I went through, and I think where a lot of people get stuck with it, where they write tests, but they write them too specifically, and then whenever changes and refactoring happen, they run face first into all these awesome tests, and they throw up their hands and go like, "This is wasting so much of my time, and it's not helpful." Um,
True.
so that is another phase. You got to push through that one. There is a path there is a path through it. It takes some feeling out to find it.
Yeah,
Um,
that's why I said I don't have a short explanation to it. It really takes a lot of time because what happens is, all right, now you've just learned how to write, your arrange, act, assert. You instantiate some objects, you act on those objects, and then you assert. You learn from that. It looks beautiful. It's great. And then you go back to the real world and you have to write tests for legacy code, and then you give up because now you have this one test or this one implementation that has like thousands of lines of code. You have no idea even where to start testing that, and that's where a lot of people give up, right? And for that, I always recommend Michael Fedor's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. It's excellent to just give you ideas on what to do there. There was a question, what's a interaction-based test and Interaction-based state-based test, that's just essentially there are some things that you're going to be calling, right? Maybe you have a function that you call with certain parameters, and the output will be like a state that comes back. So you're going to be verifying the state of the world, whatever that is, after you invoke that thing. There are cases where you don't get a state back. What you get is some sort of interaction, like, oh, I'm calling this function, and what it does is it's going to call out to an API. And the state of the world after I call that API, I don't know, because that's outside of my control. So from my side of things, the only thing I can verify is that when this code is invoked, it's called, it's going to either call this API or this other API. As long as those calls are made, my part is done. So that's interaction-based test as opposed to state-based test, where you normally get an object back, and then you assert properties on that object and make sure that it has what you're looking for.
Okay, great. So, yeah, go on.
No, well, okay. So I do want to say, like, so sorry, I switched computers. Y'all can hear me, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I do have another perspective, kind of on tests, and this is the part that I wanted to add. So start with this. Requirements are a lie.
Yeah.
So what requirements are is someone has a problem, right? And they've done some brainstorming on maybe how it could be solved, but they're trying to relay to you the problem and maybe some possible solutions that they've thought. And you have to get, and it's verbal or written or something like that. It's a communication mechanism, right? It's a synchronization thing where this thing is trying to get into your head, and then at the same, which is not going to be perfect, right? And then at the same time merging with the knowledge you have and the plans that you have in order for how to do it, right? So that's what requirements are, like all requirements, right? It is an imperfect process. They don't know everything you know. You don't know how to merge what they're saying with everything you know, and the actual communication medium is not perfect. Stuff gets dropped. So I view requirements more as a starting point, right?
Yeah.
And I view a lot of TDD as, if you kind of draw that Venn diagram, like a good chunk of that Venn diagram is actually not even in the coding or the verification area. It's in the figuring out the requirements area and what I have to do area, right? And where it's really about disambiguating more than doing. And because we know, like, right, the sooner in the process you can find an issue, the better, right? If you find an issue in production, well, that costs money, especially if a client finds it. If you find it in QA, okay, better, but you still might have a turnaround cycle of a day or two. If you find it if you find it during code review, that's better, but still it's a long one. And really the best thing you could probably do is when you have the requirements and doing that synchronization, working through any things that you can catch at that point in time. So to me, that's what a lot of TDD is you're restating the problem, you're restating the problem and the ways that people are going to go solve it, and doing it in like mechanical terms, which forces you to get much more finer grain than even the best business analysts I know tend to think about stuff, because they're thinking about things on another level. And that's how I kind of think about it, and why I come at it from that point of view of like that when then just happens to be the simplest like word structure that captures it. It doesn't have to be when then. I think I even said that in my kind of article about that. Mm-hmm. It's just what is simplest to capture the fact that something will happen, and then there's a progression of time, and I'm going to be asserting things. But that's also why I say I a lot of times say is just start with writing stuff up in English, and about what you're doing and trying to make some sort of outline, some sort of tree, because that is going to help in that process. But really, any sort of process that you have about that can help. Drawing charts can help, stuff like that. It's about the disambiguation. So that part of TDD is really just one piece of your tool belt for disambiguating requirements, but it's a very, very powerful one.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said there. And I've pulled up this blog post I've put out a couple of months ago, or actually last year, because most often when folks ask developers, hey, why are you writing tests? Usually the immediate answer, and I used to do that myself, was, oh, I'm writing tests to make sure that my code works. Ew, that's nasty. That's why, a lot of people have trouble justifying tests to businesses who say, oh, you're telling me to pay you money to spend time to make sure that your stuff is working. It's what is in it for me from the business standpoint. I've since flipped that around, where I use tests to describe my current interpretation of the quote unquote requirements, because like George said, and there is a book, A Seat at the Table, something, which is aimed at CIOs, but it's a very good book where the guy talks about it's like requirements mean that something is required to happen. Well, but most of the time, the business, the users, they don't really know what they actually need. They tell you what they want, you give it to them. Once they start using it, it's like, oh, yeah, that's not exactly what I need. So what was required now has to change, right? So that's really just a placeholder for conversation. So writing those things before you write any piece of code, the idea is to it's way easier to refine your English description of something than your TypeScript, your JavaScript, your C#, right? It's just much easier. So if you're getting something wrong, it's easier to fix if it's just an English sentence, right? Where you write down, okay, this is my interpretation of what we need to build. Get clearance from the business, from the product owner, the business analyst. Once you're all on the same page, all right, now go ahead and start writing code for that. And I always bring, and then of course there is the TDD, BDD. That was where something also broke down for me, which is like, okay, what's TDD? What's BDD? Because sometimes I hear folks saying, oh, I only do BDD, I don't do TDD anymore. Well, wait, that does not quite make sense. The idea behind behavior-driven development is that you work from the outside in. So from the business perspective, what are the expectations? What are the inputs? What are the actions? What are the outputs, right? Once you've identified that, then you can turn into, okay, what is the set of APIs into the code that will enable the behavior that we just described, right? So taking it from that standpoint, that's where you get approval from everybody around you to follow these practices. And many times it so happened that, folks ask, well, who should be writing those things, or how do we write tests for that? And one case that I always bring up is a couple of years ago when I was first starting in a project that used React. I didn't know how to write tests for React stuff yet, but I knew how to write like given when then statements for a user story. So I started pairing with the React guys to say, hey, let me see how you write React tests for your components and all. Oh, I see. Okay, now let me show you how to write the given when thens for the user stories, and I'll give that to you, and you show that to me how you can turn that into React tests. And there were times when I was the developer assigned to work on a certain feature, and I didn't know enough React at the time to actually write the test, but I would write the English sentences, because at least I would be able to just like flush out the ideas. Okay, this is what we are trying to accomplish. This is the state of the world when that feature is invoked by the user, and this is what the user expects to see as the byproduct of that. It's like, I still don't even know how to implement that in React, but I do take the time to run through that exercise of writing that stuff before I write any code. Oh, and yeah, let's pull up George's post is pretty good.
Yeah, I just put it in there because
yeah, absolutely.
As Cheyenne asked, right? Yeah, and one of the other things that I'll kind of say that I'll add, which I mentioned here, is that's part of the problem with like a lot of the getting started with TDD stuff is it's focused on the mechanics of like, okay, how do you write tests? How do you actually like, what is the flow? And you should totally do that and get a feel for it, but you should move past that really quickly. Because the thing is that when the problem is, hey, write a calculator function that'll multiply two values, right? There's no disambiguation of requirements that needs to happen there. You know 100% well what is meant. They know 100% you're going to understand what's meant, and there's not even a lot of design or anything that has to happen around that. So it's not very realistic, and it's not realistic to a point of missing a very, very, very large part of the point of TDD. So I just very much encourage people to move past those beginning examples where they're just understanding the mechanics as soon as possible. Don't get lost in that, because then you run the risk of not being able to do TDD unless things are very, very well designed and laid out for you to the point that you feel you get requirements entirely. And those are the situations where I would say actually TDD is not all that useful. You could write those tests afterwards. It's fine.
And it's funny that you mentioned the calculator one, because that's one that I often use, where I say, okay, a calculator, everybody understands. You add two numbers and you get the result. But then I say, okay, what are those numbers? What do they represent? What if the user is adding miles to kilometers or kilos to pounds, right? So it's the question, why does the business need a calculator? What are they using that for, right? And then you start unveiling these things, like the cases, and I've worked on apps where that's precisely what the users were trying to do. They are trying to add miles to kilometers, and then maybe they want that represented in yards, the result, whatever the case might be. So understanding those, and then that comes from thinking through the test cases and how is it used, who's using it, and you got it.
Well, yeah. Actually, you talked about an amazing things. The thing that I always think about, not only about the TDD, mostly about the testing, because let's assume that you're about to build a component that it use for example, a statement management like Redux or Mobax. So if you're supposed to write tests before you implement the code, it's somehow like you put, for example, 80 or 90% of your development time to only write that test. But if you ignore the test, you can handle that with only, like, say, a couple of minutes. So it's really curious for me. Is there any company that really value to this approach, or even they would be able to pay money for a developer so that he can follow the TDD approach, or it's just a buzzword that people try to say and ask if you have read about them or not?
So there are companies for that, but I think that's the exact mistake, though. And you're far from the only one. Lots and lots of people make that mistake. If you understand perfectly what needs to be done, then writing the tests out first, still useful, but is not as useful, right? If you don't understand what needs to be done, then you're not going to do it in a couple minutes or a couple hours, right? Because you're going to spend a lot of time going back and forth figuring out exactly what needs to be done and finding the edge conditions, and then having to go find the person, or even worse, not finding the edge conditions, and then they get found in QA or shipped out later on, right? and it's hard because the part of that thing about writing and doing TDD when you don't know exactly what needs to happen is hard and needs to be trained really well. But that's the situation where it's super useful. And yeah, and it actually is faster to write tests a lot of the time. I've been in plenty of situations where I've thought, I understand what needs to happen here. I'm just going to hammer it out, and then I do it and get along into it, and I'm far enough, and I'm like, I should have written tests first. I would be done now if I'd written tests first. And I mean, that doesn't happen. It's not common enough that I always write tests before every line of code, but it does happen enough that I have to stop and think about it every single time about whether I should write tests. Because the point is it'll save me money, save me time, save the company money.
So
Yeah.
you mean, sorry, so you means that the main things that help you through the testing is not the test itself, is the mindset or the force that comes from the test, that what you really want or what you're really supposed to do.
Yes. And then the fact that I can refactor really well afterwards is great. But I do that. I almost every line I rewrite multiple times. But then that could work with testing afterwards as well. That could work with paying people to just go and click through stuff as well. Like that's just a different type of thing. It's just a nice bonus to me on top of TDD.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pulling up. So was it last? No, I don't remember if it was last week or the week before. I gave a virtual lunch and learn through the improving virtual events on refactoring test code, and I talk a lot about like the reason why I write code a certain manner and the kind of value that I get out of it. And I mentioned like I haven't had to justify the time I spend writing tests to the business in many years right now. They appreciate and they bring it up because of the kind of care that I put into the tests. They are written in a way that other people will understand what's happening there, and the business can read. Even though they are not technical, they feel just fine looking over my shoulder, looking at the test and say, oh, I see what's happening there. And because I take the time to write the test using the business language, right, the ubiquitous language and all that, they follow along, and that builds trust, because it's like, oh, this guy is bringing my business into the source code. I like that. He's listening, right? Because when they start seeing like the main business terms that were discussed during, sprint planning and all of that, and they look at the code and they see those things there, it's like, oh, these guys are listening, right? They're not just slinging code like, there's no tomorrow. Or even in things like, yeah, maybe I can't spend just a couple of minutes to implement something because I know exactly what needs to be done. Well, I know at that point in time, I may completely forget about it a year later, which will cause me a lot of time just reading that code and trying to remember, why did I do that again? Well, if I take the time to write tests, the idea of writing the test there is to document the assumptions made when that code was written, as well as helping other developers who maybe, take over the project after you, and they may look at that, and whatever took you a couple of minutes to implement, for the other developer may take a long time to understand what's going on. So if you have tests documenting that, it's like, oh, I see, yeah, the tests are telling me the assumptions that were made. Now I understand why the code was written, in that manner.
Yeah, great. So the question I still have here, go Mike, if you have a question, you can ask it first.
Yeah, you want to ask Mike?
Oh yeah, thank you. Just real quick. So I know with like it depends obviously on every situation, business, budget, and all that stuff. But for like, what at what percentage of TDD do you think is more beneficial to like a business or a developer? So say like a business or a client does have money for TDD and a developer doesn't really use it. when developing code. Um, like, how would you try to explain that to the business or a client, like the benefits of it? Because that's obviously a bunch of benefits from this conversation, but like you said, sometimes there isn't a budget for it, or there isn't the space allocated for testing. So like, how would you go about explaining like that to a client or a business? Because it is beneficial, obviously, but it's difficult when you don't have the time or budget for it, to not be able to develop in that style. So yeah.
So hold on. Budgets, businesses don't have budgets allocated to testing. They never to TDD. They never will.
Right.
Well, I heard like
Yeah.
well, I guess
Yeah. No. I understand what you're saying, but what you're kind of asking there is like, do they have? Can you? How do you get budget allocated maybe to yourself to go through the process of learning how to do this darn thing, right?
okay.
And in the meantime, they get some benefit because you are doing it. But that is really kind of what we're asking. And I mean, I think that is probably like you treat it the same way as you would a request for any sort of training budget or something like that. Or if you're like learning a new tech and you're like, hey, I'm going to need some time to scale up on this. I think this kind of this workflow, this process would help here. I also think, like they don't dictate TDD to you, like any more than a business is not going to dictate to you. I don't know how you name your functions or variables. And I mean, like, now that said, there could be a team standard around it, a style guide or so on that says you either do or don't, that you do TDD, or there could be a style guide, something that says like we don't spend more than X amount of time on a ticket without like bringing in a senior person or something. Stuff like that is absolutely reasonable, but I mean, at that point, you could be like, "Hey, I was spending extra time on this because of this reason."
Right.
Now they could even be like in code reviews, like if they see you putting in tests in there, they could be like, "We don't do testing." But I mean, what are they not going to take the test into their repo? They probably will. But even if they don't, fine, write them for your own sake off to the side because it's helping you write better code.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I don't really see it as part of their purview at all, except for the idea of training. And that's one of the reasons I like my approach, is because you can go about it gradually, because it generally doesn't take a ton of training to start doing the writing stuff up manually as acceptance criteria and testing it. In fact, most of the time your QA and managers would love you for doing that, because you're doing a good chunk of the more difficult part of their work for it.
Yeah.
It just
yeah.
Interesting hearing Claudio say like like where he's at, they like look forward to that kind of stuff, which I'm sure it's out there, but just kind of don't hear that a lot, talking to other people.
Yeah.
So.
I'll tell you, it took me so many years to get to this point, right? Because in the beginning it was hard as heck, man, to gain that knowledge of how do you write your tests, what are the kind of challenges that you're going to be facing when you write tests, because some tests are very hard to actually write, and if you're writing it for like legacy systems, it's even harder. And if you don't learn how to do it properly, and what does it mean to do it properly, right? So on the beginning you just start like writing a bunch of tests, not really thinking much about what is the quality of the test that I'm writing. Hence that talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago that I've mentioned, where I specifically talk about refactoring the test code to make it look clean and make it easy. Because it's like, well, if it is hard to write tests, why is it hard, right? That's usually my first question when I'm working with new developers. Maybe they are great, say Angular or React developers, and I ask them, are you writing tests? Oh no, I'm not. Why? Oh, because it's too hard. Oh, can you please show me why it's hard? And normally it's just because they don't know practices to clean up their tests and create assets in their tests that will make it easy to write tests for it. So as I see, like usually I let teams like work through their implementation of things, and then I look how they are doing things, and then I find ways to make it easier. It's like, oh, okay, I see that there's a bunch of Angular tests. They are always doing the same things, always performing the same kind of assertions because there is a business thing that surfaces from the things that they are testing. So I find ways to clean up those assertions and create like a domain-specific language type of thing as far as the assertions, so that the next time they write a test that is very similar, there is something already there that they can just verify that, oh, the output object should have the following properties, right? Just list the properties, and there is something in place that will do the assertions for you, right? You don't have to do that yourself. So that's something I've been doing a lot, and the teams like it, because for something like this, like the experience that I've had, for it to work, you have to have at least one person on the team who knows the process really well to be able to sell it to the business and to sell it to the development team, because now you're asking developers to write tests and write better tests. Well, you have to empower them, right? If they are used to writing tests, but they don't have the proper practices in place, you have to coach them, right? And you have to take the time, you have to commit to it. So for me, it is like a multi-sprint type of thing. Like every sprint, I try to, make something better just a little bit. And that compounds. After, a number of sprints, what I hear from developers is something like, oh yeah, now that, whenever I look at projects that don't have tests written in this manner, I hate it, right? So they end up like falling in love with this approach because it's easy for them. It becomes easy to write tests, right? At least the most common tests that they are writing all the time. And from the business perspective, I always set those expectations. Like, okay, this is what the team is going to be doing. We're going to be spending time in conversations around how to write tests and how to improve the tests. And this is the kind of benefit that you're getting. So I create like an outline to explain to the business, this is what you, the business, will get out of this. Better comprehension of what we're building for you. Since we're spending more time in conversations to spend less time in implementation and the round trip between like, okay, the business says, this is what I want. Developers go implement something, come back, right? And then the business says, no, that's not exactly what I need. Go back to the drawing board, make changes, deploy, DevOps, test, and all that, like manual tests. And then all of this costs money. Who's tracking that time? As opposed to the time of, oh yeah, you spent like 2 hours in the discussion writing some tests. Nobody's tracking those, right? It's more about the value. So I sell the business into the value of the practice, and they appreciate it, and they don't ask, well, are you spending 60% of your time writing tests and 40% implementing? They don't ask that because they're seeing the results. They're seeing the benefits out of it.
Cool. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Does that kind of answer TDD stuff? Or
Yeah, that was pretty robust.
Sorry, man. Yeah.
No, I love it.
Let's see. I think you're on mute, man.
I said no, thank you.
Oh my God.
All right.
I was mute.
Okay, there you go. You're welcome, Mike.
So you mentioned about two amazing things. Yes, first of all, you mentioned that you implemented the DT approach to new companies that they didn't did that before. They didn't work on that before. Secondly, you mentioned that you provide some tools chain or something like that to make the process easy. So my question is that let's imagine I have a big project. I didn't implement the TDD before and I want to start from now to work on TDD. George previously mentioned that, okay, if you're supposed to use TDD, so probably you need to have some measures or some pre-requirements on your project so that you can implement the TDD. So here is my question. Can I hold my project from now on from what I'm currently have and implement the TDD approach from now? Or no, I need to move back and restructure and refactor from the project from the beginning to be able to add the TDD approach and unit test and these kind of stuff.
George, you want to take that?
You can you can write tests for existing code. So I think you can do TDD for new stuff relatively easily as long as it kind of fits all your structures and existing libraries. However, you probably won't be able to use some of the same code patterns that you've been using. And if you need to test, your tests need to touch any pre-existing code, unless it was already written with dependency injection principles in mind, you will have some work to do in order to make it possible to test that code. And that applies to TDD or test after, right? Any sort of unit testing. The issue is that if you like have a class, like oftentimes, an example oftentimes is like a controller class. Does some logic inside of it when you hit a route, right? And you want to test that logic. But part of that is that it's going to hit a database. We can't hit a database in your actual unit test. You could, but then the test might break just because the database is down or the database doesn't have the data you expect in it, right? And even if it does have the data expected in it, that's going to make your tests slower. And after you have a couple hundred of those tests, you're going to stop running them. So what you need to get, the point you need to get to is one where you can stub out all external dependencies and run things entirely in memory. And there's a bunch of techniques for doing that, but that does require code changes. However, you can still write acceptance criteria ahead of time and do that exercise and find opportunities to TDD where you can.
Right. Yeah, and that's I've done that a lot where there's an existing system, a legacy system, nobody's doing TDD, totally fine, all right, we're going to be writing maybe some code that's change requirements to something that exists. All right, let me try writing a test before I make those changes to describe the thing that we're going to be testing. And then, all right, now I'm tapping into the legacy code. Like George said, it may prove to be very challenging because like legacy systems tend to have a lot of dependencies that you don't even know that you have. So it's really like controlling the pace based on what you have. What I usually do is, okay, there are no tests for the existing stuff. If I do have to write something new based on something that already exists and I cannot quite do the TDD thing, well, all right, let me at least try to write some test that will give me some coverage from that so that I can learn what's going on with that code base, right? Where are the dependencies? Where are the things that are like very brittle? That's like, oh yeah, if you touch this, it's going to touch on all these other things here and then evolve. But then again, like George said, for the, like if it's something like completely new, yep, I can just go through the exercise of at least trying. And that's the thing. Sometimes or all the time, I at least try to start, from the test first mentality, right? To like flex that muscle. Sometimes I fail. It's like I don't know how to actually write the test because of the way that the existing code is implemented. There's no way to do that. I'm going to have to finish off the implementation and then come back and figure out how to actually test the thing, right?
Yeah, okay. So my last and hardest question.
Hey guys, I got to drop off, unfortunately.
Thank you.
It was a good conversation. Thanks.
It was, yeah. I'll stick around for another few minutes there. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, Yeah, my last question is, can you share me any resources that would be a tutorial, a step by step, to go through a real small app, not just an input or not just an like say a button, but it would be a small app like a to-do or anything just like that, and it follow a TDD approach so that I can see each step and each interaction with the code and with the rest of the things.
Okay.
Did you ever see any tutorial or any resources like that?
Because I've learned a lot of this over a period of 17 years now, it's going to be very hard for me to tell you, oh, there's this one tutorial that you follow and you're going to get there. Like, I've used a lot of different books and blog posts and my own just trying things. I know that one of my favorite ones, it's a book by Robert Martin. It's called Agile Practices, Patterns, and something else. It's this book here. Now, while it is, it uses C# as the language, it was actually, I think the original one was for either Java or C++, I don't remember, but it doesn't matter what language. It's the mindset that it shows. Like this book because it talks about the solid principles. It talks about writing tests. It talks about design patterns. And I like because it uses this approach of like following TDD as you are doing refactoring, right? So he presents, for example, okay, there's this existing code, and now there's a change of requirements, and we need to make the code do something else. Okay, let's use TDD for that. So he writes the test, and then he starts refactoring the code backed up by having tests, right? And then you learn about, say, design patterns going through this process, right? Because like, okay, this is the existing code. By the end, we actually have like an implementation of the factory design pattern or of the strategy design pattern, right? So it kind of like taps learning these other things and using TDD along the way. So I would recommend, it's a kind of a thick book, but it does cover a lot of ground. And again, the kind of things that I've learned in this book, I actually apply when I'm doing like TypeScript, JavaScript, or whatever else. It's the mindset that counts in that case. So that's one that I would recommend. I remember many years ago, Roy Oshrov had a book that I remember at the time was pretty useful, and I think he has a newer version, like a revisited version. This one here, The Art of Unit Testing. Again, it is based in C#, but it doesn't matter whether you're writing TypeScript or JavaScript or C#. It's the mindset behind writing the test. You have the requirements. What do you do with that? I think those two could get you started.
I would appreciate if you can share those on the comments so that
Oh yeah,
I can grab them easier.
sure. Oops, copy link address. Here you go. That is one. And this is the other one. And I'll also drop in, because once you get heavier into like writing more and more tests, like I said, it ends up getting hard when you are testing things that has already a legacy code base. Michael Feathers, it will pop up. I think it's, I don't remember any other book by him. This one, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. Excellent book. I've learned a lot of stuff from this book here.
I also would appreciate if you can share any resources or any blog post about the testing, the type of test, how we should expand our knowledge and experience on testing, anything that you find it useful, because I'm supposed to focus on testing for a couple of months to at least learn and how to and understand how should I start it and why should I start on that.
Yeah, I will essentially point you out to my blog, because I have a bunch of blog posts tagged testing, or test in whatever shape or form. So if you just let me drop it there. But the cool thing is that I mean, you go down like things here, you'll find like, look at this blog post. It's from back in 2008 when I was still figuring out, test first, unit test, TDD, integration test. What the heck are all those things, right? So it tells you like how far back I go with testing practices. But from there, you can like kind of see my my evolution in my test practices, because as I went on like learning things, I was documenting it through blog posts. So that's might help you out as well.
Thank you so much for sharing.
You are very welcome. All right, I do need to hop off and get ready for the rest of the day. Thanks, guys. I feel like this was a very productive conversation. Thanks for participating and asking questions and all that. And I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you so much. Have a great week.
All right, bye. You too.